Okay, so we've got a counter, basic counter, with incrementing cookie click. The state for that is stored in our cookie clicker component, which is on our page down here. I also want to show the current number of cookies up in the header to show like a high score or whatever it may be. How do we get the state of that value up into the header? Well, in here, we would have to pull out the state and the function, move them up into the page, and then pass the function down into the cookie clicker and the values of the current number of clicked cookies down into current cookies and down into the cookie clicker. So we'd effectively have to lift state up, right? There's a common thing in React. We're like, okay, we need to move the state up to the most common parent component. So we need state here, which means our page needs to become a client component because it needs state, or we need to, like, how does this make sense? And then we would need to pass down the increment cookies function like that, and the number of cookies like that. And we would then also pass the cookies down like this. We need to import useState in our page. Cookies are not defined because cookie clicker doesn't have cookies anymore, so we'd need increment cookies and cookies that are passed down as props, and our current cookies needs cookies passed in as props. And now we can show cookies, right? So now when I click it, they both increment. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. But this works in a simple demonstration like this. We've elevated the state up to the level of the page, made our page a client page. All good. They share the state. The state is now passed down. No problemo. But what if we want to show it on a different page, or we want to show it in the footer or somewhere else on the site? We want to make a deeply nested component that's got 10 parent components, and right down at the bottom we need to know the number of cookies because, I don't know, maybe we're making it, changing the color of something based on the number of cookies, and that appears right down the component tree 10 levels deep. We don't really want to be passing cookies down the tree through every component, doing prop drilling to get to the bottom. So, and also, actually, we really don't want our page to be a client component. So we get around that with context. And context is a little bit of a tricky concept to get your head around, but actually it's very simple. You create a context. The context contains the state of your cookie number, and you can then use that context throughout any component in the app without having to pass the values down as props. The way that works is I'm going to make a folder called context, and I'll make a file called cookie context. Oops, not cookie contest, although that would be fun, wouldn't it? And then just from the docs, we'll copy the basic examples. Here we go, here's the example. So we're going to create a context like this. So we'll create a context, which we'll import from React. We'll call it cookie context, the context of all cookies, and the default value, which will be 0, because there's no cookies when you start, right? So then we will create a function that we'll export called cookie provider. No, return. In context, we don't want that. We want a cookie context provider. We don't need that form. What is that all about? And what is this value thing? Well, to start with, it's going to just be 0. So you can sort of see where this is going, right? We have this provider that has our value. Okay, that makes some sense. So where's our page? Let's go and get our cookie state and our setCookies function. We'll get rid of that for now. We don't need it anymore. And I'm going to put that in the provider. See where we're going? Now I can pass the cookies down as a value. This is now, will provide the value of this object. And let's say we're going to pass down the cookies and the increment cookies function. So now we've got a value passed in by the provider, and we're going to need to add children here, by the way. And then inside that provider, we'll render our children, whatever they may be. And then we'll also export a function called useCookies. Returns useContext cookie context. And then we'll use our, instead of use state, we'll use our useCookies hook, custom hook for useCookies. And increment cookies function is also passed down from the provider, remember? We'll import useContext from React in our provider, in our context file. And then it's still not doing anything because there's one final step we need to do. And that is, so I'm going to put this here. I'm going to make a component called providers. Like that. And just at the top level, I'm just going to make a file called providers.jsx. Export a function called providers. Accepts our children, returns the children, and wraps the children in our cookie context, in our cookie provider, like that, which I will import from our cookie context. This needs to be a client component, but providers is not defined. I haven't imported it down here. Import it. Game on. Use state is not defined in the context. Obviously, we need to import state if we're going to use that. And now, hey look, they're both in sync. That's context, that's it, that's all there is. So, as you can imagine, both of these components now, let's look at them on the page. We can show the current cookies, we can show the cookie clicker, and actually we can show that absolutely anywhere we want in the site now, as long as it appears below our layout with the providers component. So anything within the body of our website can now access the cookie clicker. So if I come in here and I say, oh, I'm going to make a footer component. In fact, let's do it in our layout. I'm going to have a footer component here at the bottom of the page called footer. Let's make that component. So I'm just working away on my website, blah, 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 blah. This is the footer component. Return footer. This is the, copyright, etc. Copious cookies incorporated, right? And we want to show the count of the cookies. Well, we can just say, what's the component called? Current cookies. We can just render current cookies here. Oops. Import that. No, you're going to do it. Come on. Import current cookies. It's now in the footer. And we'll import the footer. Boom. Now it works. When we click the button, oh look, now the header updates, the increment updates, and the cookies updates. Perfect. We can include that component literally anywhere we want. It'll reach into the context, grab the number of cookies, and render them out. That's it. That's the entirety of context. And all of it is done with those handful of lines where we create a provider. So when we create a cookie context with this create context, we might want to say cookies equals 10 by default. That doesn't work because I'm passing 0 here. In fact, we can do it like that. We don't need the default here. We can just create an empty context to start with. And now they all start at 10 because our default state here is 10 cookies. And then we pass in to the provider the values, the cookies and the functions So then if we wanted to add a function decrement cookies, set cookies to be the number of cookies minus 1. We then pass that down as well to make it available in the context. Decrement cookies. Oops. Decrement cookies, like that. But it may be that we only want that to be usable in a component that like removes cookies. So remove cookies button.jsx. Export function remove cookies button. Oops, if I could type, that'd be better. Return a button, steal cookies, and then we'll say, okay, I want to decrement cookies from my useCookies function, and then on click, I'll say decrement cookies. Obviously it has to be client because it's using an event handler now. So then if I render in my footer the remove cookies button, I've now got this steal cookies button. I can increment cookies, does it in all 3 places, and then I can steal cookies, also does it in all 3 places. Hopefully that demonstrates the magic of context. That's basically all there is to it. Complex state can be really annoying. So maybe now we've got all of our cookie stuff set up, boom, 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 steal some cookies, boom, 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 boom. We might decide that in our context where we manage the state of what our cookies are, and notice that it means that now the state of our cookie value is completely separated out from our UI component tree. So we're not polluting our UI components with a bunch of state management stuff. The state management stuff can be tucked away in our cookie management. If we want to add a bunch of features to our cookies, then we can. So we might use a reducer to do that. We'll convert, instead of using state, because we've decided we want to add a bunch more capabilities to our cookies. We might want a button that increments it by 10, say, or a button that increments it by 50. But let's just increment these 2 states first. So we'll say, okay, function cookies reducer. Reducer, the signature is very simple. State object and the action to perform on that state. So we have state and we have an action, and then we switch on the action.type, and we'll say if the switch is increment, return the existing state plus the cookie state incremented by 1. If the case is decrement, return the state and the state of the cookies minus 1. That's it. And so then instead of this and these, we'll get rid of that and we'll say const. This is actually going to be state and dispatch. Dispatch being no. useReducer. So then we pass in the reducer, the cookies reducer, and the default state for the cookies. Oh, Kunst. There you go. Don't need the brackets. Const state. There we go. So now down here, we can pass down our state, which includes our cookies, and we can pass down our dispatch function, which can dispatch all of our cookie actions. So this is obviously already broken because I haven't imported useReducer. Nothing works because we've destroyed the state that we're storing. But actually the state now exists within the reducer and we can perform all of these actions on it. So now in my components for the cookie clicker, instead of increment cookies, we'll get the state and the dispatch. And then here we'll show state.cookies. And then we'll make a dispatch function with the type increment. Now that works. works, right? So we'll just quickly update these other ones to use state.cookies. Now that's updated in the header, and our other button in the footer works as well. So all of our buttons state now works still. And in order to remove cookies, we just need to change this, take the dispatch function, and then we can say make a function to dispatch a decrement event. Now I can increment the cookies, and then I can steal. Oh, no, I can't. What have I done wrong? Oh yeah, it needs to be type. It needs to be an object with the type. Decrement. Oops. There we go. So now add cookies, steal cookies. Why might we want to do that? Well, now instead of having to write a bunch of new functions in our context, we can say, I don't know, like instead of increment and decrement, we can cook a batch, cookie batch, create batch. And I'd often end up doing it like this. We do it caps. What does a batch do? Creates 10 cookies. Simples. Make it lowercase just for the sake of this example. And so now in our cookie clicker, we want another button. I'll just copy this one. Cook a batch of cookies. Set this to create batch. And now it goes up by 10. You can see that by simply having the reducer now, we just say, well, where is it? We can define a set of actions. So we can eliminate all the cookies, eat all cookies. Set the cookies, just reset the state, immediately set it to 0. So then if I add a button, I can make a whole new component, that I can use wherever I want, eat all cookies button, export function, eat all cookies. Oops. Gosh, it'd be good if I could type, wouldn't it? Functin. Make a button, eat all the cookies. And then it'll be on click. We will simply dispatch eat all. What did I call it? Where's the context? Eat all cookies, yeah. Eat all the cookies. Have to make it an object, give it a type of the like that. This will have to be a client component. And then we just need to, oops, state and dispatch of use cookies. Import use cookies. So now I've got an eat all cookies button, which we can render anywhere we like. Where's a good place to put it? Let's just put it in the footer for sake of example. Eat all cookies button. Boom. Oh, silly me. There we go. So now increment the cookies, cook a batch of cookies, steal a cookie, and then eat all the cookies. Done. So that is how I would probably start designing things like this, because now it's very easy for me to just add a new case. When the action type is a different type, do a different thing. Actions can also have payload, so we could easily add a situation where we want steal cookies to eat more than one cookie at a time. So let's say we want to dispatch the cookies in a common. It's common to use a payload object, but you don't have to. Just say we want you to eat 4 cookies or 3 cookies at a time. So the payload is 3. When we're in our context, payload comes in, the action, which is this object here, has a payload. And instead of minus that, we can say if our action.payload remove the action.payload or 1. So now when I refresh, I can increment the cookies, I can cook a bunch of batches of cookies, and I can steal 2 cookies at a time, 3 cookies at a time, because I'm sending the payload. The payload is 3. If I change that to 10, we'll eat 10 cookies at a time. Well, we will if I don't reset the state, cook a bunch of cookies, eat all the cookies, cook a bunch of cookies, steal 10 cookies at a time. So now all my sort of state updating function, instead of being intertwined in a bunch of useState stuff tucked away in a bunch of components and passed through all the components as props, is now all nice and neatly confined to this cookies reducer, which I can then export and use in tests. So I can say import the cookies reducer, give it a state and an action, and then check what it returns. So, I mean, we can do this anywhere, but in a test it's great because you can then say, hey, check the state updates, do what we expect. And we can say, okay, well, it's just a function. It's just a pure function that we can run in vitest. So we can say, we can do it here just to demonstrate. We can say, so call the cookies reducer. Result equals cookies reducer. We'll give it a state, which is cookies are 0, and we'll give it an action, which is of type increment, and then we'll console log the result. So now when that function runs, or when that component loads, our result would be an object with cookies of 1. So you can see how that makes a lot of sense, right? And then if we say decrement and we give it a payload, so we'll say the action we want to test actually is decrement, and the action does have a payload, and the payload reduces the number of cookies by 5. We can now see that the result is cookies is -5. So it's now a nice testable pure function that is responsible for updating our state. And then all our components do, in this case we're passing it down, but we don't have to use reducers with context, but they do work quite well together. This is nice and testable. You can always say, well, when we've got this state and we have this action occur on our state, do we get the expected output? You don't care about what's rendered on the screen. It's just that happens almost automatically. So as long as you then use that function here, job done. You can wrap this. So in our use cookies hook, we could say, oh, this is our cookies context. We don't want to be passing down dispatch raw. We could say function increment and function decrement. And what does it do? It dispatches type increment. What does that do? It dispatches type decrement. And then we could pass those down explicitly. So we could pass dispatch, we could pass increment and decrement, and it still would work the same. So then instead here we could say increment. In fact, it's decrement that we want. And then instead of the ugly dispatch, we can still then say decrement. But under the hood, that decrement function is just dispatching an action to our reducer, which hits the decrement case in our reducer that modifies our state, returns the new state, everything's hunky-dory. So it looks a bit complicated maybe when you do it like that, but it makes sharing state and managing different actions within your apps significantly easier. And that's about it, really.